Welcome into the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show. Today, we're going to be continuing our rankings week with our top 24 plus quarterbacks, question mark, Dave. We always overpromise, overdeliver. That's what this show does. But we're going to be breaking down our quarterbacks into their tiers, their respective tiers. Some of these rankings might be a bit different than what you're used to. We're going to take a look at who we like more than the consensus average draft position, some quarterbacks we might be avoiding, and really who we want you guys to be targeting in your fantasy drafts. Dave, let's get started here with tier 1 for both of us. And by the way, before we do this, the scoring that we're looking at is going to be 4 point per passing touchdown. I know that does change things a bit for people, but we are going with the standard 4 point per passing touchdown format for quarterbacks. So tier 1. At number 1, we've got Josh Allen. At 2, Patrick Mahomes. 3, Jalen Hurts. And 4, Lamar Jackson.
Should we just move on to the next tier? You and I are in lockstep here. This is how ADP is fleshed out. Like, as fun as it is to take a stand at the top of rankings and say, I think this player is better than this player. I think ADP's just got it right this year.
Yeah, well, I was going to say there's actually still a good amount of people that have Jalen Hurts at quarterback 2. So you and I both have Patrick Mahomes at quarterback 2. You and I were kind of talking about this before the show that I was saying, man, if Mahomes is going to be quarterback 2, he's going to have to throw at least 40 touchdowns to do it and then get some touchdowns on the ground. And look, last year, it was his best rushing season, 0 touchdowns on the ground. And now he's got probably his best receiving core of his entire career. Mm-hmm. So throwing 40 touchdowns is not very hard for Patrick Mahomes.
He's done it twice already in his career.
Yeah. And everything's kind of, the stars are aligning for this. So is that where you were with Mahomes over Hurts? Is there anything from Hurts that maybe just detracted you a little bit?
Saquon Barkley being there is definitely going to change things a little bit for Jalen Hurts. So much of his value has come from rushing touchdowns. And I think that they want to try to protect Jalen Hurts a little bit. I don't think they want him doing the tush push anymore. And my guess is that we'll see him doing a lot more of what Lamar Jackson has done in years past when they get near the goal line, just turn around and stick the ball in his running back's belly. So I think that could definitely cap the upside for Jalen Hurts a little bit. But the reports out of camp are that he is just meshing so well in this new offense here. So we could see the passing upside elevated a little bit more if they start skewing a little bit more pass heavy. Apparently, everybody, Jalen Hurts, Devonta Smith, AJ Brown, everybody is just getting on board with this new passing offense. So I'm not going to sit here and fade Jalen Hurts, even if he does lose out on the tush push and some of the goal line touchdowns that have made him so valuable in years past. I think there's an untapped passing upside that we haven't seen before. But I've got him and Lamar Jackson neck and neck. And if you're in a draft and you want to take Lamar Jackson ahead of Jalen Hurts, I wouldn't fault you for it whatsoever. I've got those guys kind of as my QB3A and QB3B. They're super, super tight for me. So I prefer Jalen Hurts ever so slightly, but wouldn't judge anybody for taking Lamar there.
Yeah, those guys are incredibly close. And like you said, out of Eagles camp, we are not hearing a bad thing about anyone. The entire offense allegedly looks great. This kind of happens each year, though.
Jalen Hurts threw his first touchdown today. Went over 2 weeks without a touchdown. Today, he threw his first touchdown. Or, I'm sorry, not touchdown, interception.
First, I was like, wait a second. That does not go along with the report.
No, he's been throwing a lot of touchdowns. Threw his first interception today. First interception of training camp in week 3. That's crazy.
Drop him down the boards. Quarterback 7. All right, let's go to our second tier. Where
before we move on, can I just say one more thing? What I want to say, I talked about how close Lamar Jackson was, and I think Lamar Jackson overall had, somewhat of a disappointing season last year. It wasn't as great as people had hoped in this Todd Monken offense. But if you look at the second half of the year, that's where it really started to click. And from week 9 onward, the second half of the season, he was pacing for over 4,000 yards and over 1,000 rushing yards. Now, we've never seen a quarterback do that before, 4,000 passing yards and 1,000 rushing yards. So if Lamar Jackson is able to, get a little bit more comfortable in year 2 in Todd Monken's offense, that's why I'm saying, he's really close with Jalen Hurts for me. And this whole tier is really close, but I think Lamar Jackson has just as high of a chance of finishing as the overall quarterback 1 as anybody else in this tier.
Dave, there's sort of the thing that we do every year where we say this position group is deeper than ever. There's so much value. I don't necessarily believe that the quarterback position is incredibly deep. However, I do believe that the value of the players throughout the first tier, second tier, are actually pretty flat, where we
Mhm.
could see someone who we've got ranked at quarterback 12 finish in the top five. It feels very similar to tight end, where there's a steep drop off of guys that could finish at the top of their position, but there are so many of them this year that could
Yeah.
do that.
And I think, I'm always trying to catch the players at the end of tiers. So in very few drafts this year, you'll see me paying up for Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. But when those guys are off the board and then I can get Lamar Jackson, I have way more Lamar Jackson than anybody else because this tier is so tight. And with him being the fourth guy drafted in this tier, I'd rather take my chances on Lamar Jackson than pay up a round earlier for Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes.
All right, before we move on to our second tier of quarterbacks, I want to remind everybody you have a bunch of ways that you can enjoy this show. First one being on youtube.com/ at Football Guys Fantasy. And if you're watching here, first of all, thank you. Be sure to like this episode. Leave a comment down below of what quarterbacks you think we should be moving up or down in our rankings, maybe something you disagree with here. And then also, we had the audio side as well. If you're not into YouTube, that's okay. We've got the show on Apple and Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. So once you finish listening to this episode, please leave a 5-star review. Let us know what you like about the show. Dave, let's move on to tier number 2 here. And at quarterback number 5, we've got Anthony Richardson. At 6, Kyler Murray. 7, CJ Stroud. 8, Joe Burrow. 9, Dak Prescott. 10, Jordan Love. 11, Jayden Daniels. And 12, Brock Purdy. Now, the reason I said this before we even hopped over to this tier that, man, there's guys at quarterback 12 that could finish in the top 5. It's
Jaden
because Brock
Daniels.
Purdy. Yeah, Jayden Daniels could finish there. Brock Purdy finished as quarterback 6 last year. Dak Prescott was quarterback 3. This entire tier is pretty flat. However, there are a few guys up at the top that seem to have just some fantastic rushing upside, players that you and I are both willing to draft higher than ADP or willing to draft higher than most people. Anthony Richardson and Kyler Murray. I think Kyler Murray specifically is the guy that you and I have really planted a flag on. Uh,
Mhm.
Before this show, I moved Kyler Murray from quarterback 6 up to quarterback 5. And you said, "Are you sure about that? You sure about that?"
Flame him in the
So
comments, everyone. Tell Alfredo
I
how good
know.
he is.
Yeah. What an idiot. What a moron. But all the things are really starting to, I don't want to say cave in, but when it comes to Anthony Richardson, we do have the injury concerns that have followed him from college.
Yeah.
And it's honestly, it's not good analysis to sit here and say a player can or will get injured because they all can. Uh, but when we start to see a trendency, if you will, you do get a little more nervous. But outside of that, because all these quarterbacks can get hurt, Kyler was hurt last year. For me, with Anthony Richardson, it's how much could he actually struggle with the passing part? He still does not have a lot of experience. And we get the reports yesterday coming out of camp that he was going. I wish I could remember right now. It's either the Bengals or I believe it was the Buccaneers. But he in camp, he was struggling to complete passes. I think it was the Bengals where he was struggling to complete passes throughout camp to the point where the entire defense was just taunting him in what was an absolutely horrible day for the Indianapolis Colts. So while I know Richardson has the rushing upside, the injury stuff, the passing downside, just makes me put him just one step below Kyler Murray, who we've seen do it before as a top 3 fantasy quarterback.
And juxtaposed to just last week, where the Bengals were doing joint practices with the Chicago Bears, and the reports were this defense could not stop Caleb Williams, that he was
Hey,
just
now,
picking them apart. So,
look at you.
it is concerning that the Bengals, their secondary hasn't looked great, and that they're able to put a clamp on Anthony Richardson like that. But I think with Richardson, we talked about it. What we saw last year in a small sample size on a per dropback basis, nobody was scoring more fantasy points, and of course, a lot of that came on the back of touchdowns, but we saw Shane Steichen was the one that developed the tush push and turned Jalen Hurts into this fantasy beast. So I think that we're going to see a pretty similar trajectory for Anthony Richardson here. We're talking about this as one big tier with Richardson all the way down to Purdy, but I think Richardson and Murray are kind of in a tier of their own ahead of CJ Stroud and Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott and Jordan Love. I think these two are kind of in this own separate mini tier where they both have elite rushing output and they could both finish number one at the position. Now, Kyler Murray, I've talked about it. His rookie season, he was a QB 12. Last year, he was the per game QB 9 coming off the ACL tear. every other season he's been in the league, he's been a top 5 quarterback. So the ceiling is absolutely there. The floor is there. Now he's got the weapons around him with, Marvin Harrison and year 3 of Trey McBride. The stars are aligning for Kyler Murray to have a huge, huge season. So Lamar Jackson, I talked about kind of being my primary target in that elite tier. But if I don't get Lamar Jackson, I'm totally okay falling back on Anthony Richardson or Kyler Murray. And then if I can't get them, I'm okay falling back on Jayden Daniels. I just did this draft manifesto that I've talked about on a couple of shows this week, published over at footballguys.com if you want to check it out. But one of the things that I say, like, regardless of the platform you're playing on, if you're drafted on Underdog, Sleeper, Yahoo, ESPN, NFL, CBS, it doesn't matter. This is a good year to wait on quarterbacks. There are a lot of quarterbacks that you can draft very, very late that can still give you immense upside. And here we are through the top 12 talking about guys that we like to target. But once we get into 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, there's still guys that have high ceilings. So this is a year where I think you just want to be disciplined and exercise some patience and let your league mates draft the quarterbacks early. Well, you can still get some good value very late.
Dave, last week we talked about how you can beat the ESPN fantasy app with their ADP and the sleeper app. And there's a lost episode somewhere in there of where we talked about Yahoo, but it wasn't actually Yahoo. Sorry, everyone at Yahoo and the audience. That'll be one for the archives. But looking right now, Kyler Murray is going as the quarterback 10 on ESPN in round 7.
Crazy.
And on Sleeper, he's going at that exact same turn at the 612, where on ESPN, he's going at the 701. Kyler Murray is going very, very late in drafts. And it makes me ask, is he going to be the best value at the quarterback spot? I do think Jayden Daniels is right up there with him. And there are some other, Dak Prescott, Jordan Love. But Dave, it makes me ask the question, who is the best quarterback value out of this tier, out of this area?
It's definitely Kyler Murray where he's going. And, I'm looking back, we just did this draft that we live streamed a few days ago, and I practice what I preach. I say, like, let my league mates pay up for these other guys, catch the guys falling at the end of the tier. And we saw the way that it happened in our draft. Josh Allen went in round 4. Patrick Mahomes went in round 5. In round 6, we saw Jalen Hurts go off the board. And then I said, cool, well, here I am in round 6. And I took Lamar Jackson, who was at the end of our tier 1. And I felt good about that at the time. And then what happened is Kyler Murray fell to round 9, 3 rounds after I got Lamar Jackson. And I was kicking myself because basically what I did is, I took a 0 running back approach where my RB2 was Tajay Spears. What I could have done was, instead of drafting Lamar Jackson in round 6 and Tajay Spears in round 9, I could have drafted David Montgomery in round 5 or round 6 and then Kyler Murray in round 9. And you start looking at that, the kind of 2 options that I would have had. I think I'd much prefer David Montgomery and Kyler Murray than I would Lamar Jackson and Tajay Spears. So it's one of those things where I did pay up for a quarterback, and then you see Kyler Murray going in round 9, and you see Jayden Daniels going at the end of round 9, and I'm kind of kicking myself saying I should have just been a little bit more disciplined and waited on quarterback here.
Dave, some of the other quarterbacks in this tier are guys that I think most drafters are taking much earlier, specifically CJ Stroud. You and I don't want to say that we've been naysayers or we've been, poo-pooing the idea of drafting CJ Stroud or the player himself. We simply don't like where he's being drafted. And I actually think us having Stroud at quarterbacks 8 and 7 respectively is actually pretty damn good for a guy who last season, Dave, he was, let me just take a look at it right here. He was the quarterback
11, I believe.
11. Yeah, quarterback 11. And to go from 11 to 7 or 8, we are expecting a big jump. What I don't understand is why there are people willing to draft him at quarterback 5 without the rushing upside, with an aging Stephon Diggs. I'm just not there yet, Dave. You're one spot higher than me, so I guess that makes you the CJ Stroud activist here on the podcast. Can you give me an insight as to why he would be getting drafted that much higher, or why people would be ranking him even a little bit higher?
He had the best rookie season of all time, and I understand that people want to draft in a guy who did that because you expect him to take that year 2 jump, and it's possible. Like, CJ Stroud could throw for 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns this year and pay off at his ADP, but For me, and maybe this is just, best ball brain rot, but I don't want CJ Stroud or Joe Burrow unless I have a Texans or a Bengals wide receiver. Like if I have Jamar Chase, then I'm okay kind of adding Joe Burrow to my team because I've already made a strong investment in the Cincinnati passing attack, and Joe Burrow obviously needs to support that. Same thing if I pay up in round 2 for Nico Collins, or if I get Tank Dell in round 4, then I'm a little bit more apt to look CJ Stroud's way because I've already made the investments in the Houston Texans offense. But if I don't have a Bengals or a Texans wide receiver, I mean, CJ Stroud and Joe Burrow need to fall into like round 8 or 9 for me to even think about
Hmm.
drafting them at that point.
Well, right now, CJ Stroud on average is going in the late fourth, early fifth round,
Yeah.
which
uh,
just feels irresponsible.
Yeah, that's going to be a no for me, dog. Um, yeah, and looking right now, we did this league with all of our football guys. I hate to call us experts. I mean, I don't know,
Stafford.
analysts, staffers. Yeah, football guys, staffers. And you say that CJ Stroud is an ADP at the end of round 4. In this draft, he fell all the way to the end of round 8. And it's just, I think, a testament to how the industry kind of views CJ Stroud. And I understand, like, he had an amazing rookie season, and now he's got better weapons around him in year 2. He could take that big step forward, but it's kind of jarring to me that in all of these industry drafts that I do with people who are just living and breathing fantasy football, and I know you sit it in your flex league too, like the expert draft that you did in New York recently, where CJ Stroud fell to round 8 or 9, I believe. And that's what you see is like when you're like the ADP is staying firm in round 4 and 5 because people want to keep taking the risk on CJ Stroud. But then in all of these analysts, expert industry drafts that I've been doing throughout the offseason, I consistently see him fall into rounds 8 and 9, which is, I haven't seen a big split on any player the way that I've seen on CJ Stroud.
So let me ask you this then: would that be your takeaway? Let's divert a little bit away from rankings here and just talking about draft strategy for quarterbacks. Since we see this tier of talented quarterbacks so flat, are you just more likely to sit around and wait till round 7, 8, 9 for a quarterback and just take the best one left in that tier, like a Jayden Daniels, a Dak Prescott, Kyler, Joe Burrow, whoever just falls to you there in those rounds?
Yeah, and I think Dak is a great target. This is a guy who has a QB1 finish. He was the QB3 last year, and for some reason, it's just sliding way down draft boards. But I just did that again. I'll revert back. I'm sorry, Alfredo. I'm sure I'm annoying you talking about this draft day manifesto that I wrote, but I said that there are 3 players that I am trying to target, and it's Kyler Murray, it's Jayden Daniels, and oh my gosh, why am I completely drawing a blank now? Kyler Murray, Jayden Daniels, and Anthony Richardson.
Oh,
And it's because those guys are all Anthony Richardson is, going to be the most expensive of the bunch. You can get Kyler Murray a little bit cheaper, but Jaden Daniels is the guy for me, where he's getting drafted. His ADP is QB12. Knowing that I can get Jaden Daniels after my league mates have taken Jordan Love and Dak Prescott and Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud and Brock Purdy in a lot of cases, Jaden Daniels is the guy that could rush for 1,200 yards and just completely break fantasy football. You could potentially be drafting the overall QB1 here in round 10, 11, or 12.
I think the crazy thing that stands out to me here is you mentioned Jaden Daniels, you mentioned Dak Prescott. I think if you're willing to draft Anthony Richardson, you should be willing to sit and wait for Jaden Daniels
Hmm.
because it's the same. Essentially the same guy. If you're willing to draft CJ Stroud up at quarterback 5, you should be willing to draft Dak Prescott or Jordan Love at quarterbacks 9 and 10 in ADP. And to me, that tells me everything I need to know about the quarterback rankings, where they're going in drafts, and just the quarterback value in general. I'm willing to wait because we can get the same type of production around 2 or 3 rounds later. And that's telling me everything I need to know. Dave, we looked at that football guy staffer league draft that you mentioned. You talked about how CJ Stroud went in round 8. The other quarterbacks that went in round 9, Kyler Murray at the 904. I took Joe Burrow at the 908. Then Caleb Williams at 909, Dak Prescott at 910, Jaden Daniels at 911. So it really feels like you can sit there and wait until, let's say, maybe because this was Stafford League, it went a little bit later, but you could probably wait till round 7 to really make your pick of a good value quarterback from here.
Yeah, I completely agree. This just isn't the year to pay up. And, I've done a lot of drafts, and every time that I pay up for a quarterback, I look back at the draft board and say, dang it, I should have waited.
The last guy in this tier who, I mean, you could argue he maybe doesn't belong here, but I think
He-
last year's
He's in the
performance,
tier below, I think.
last year's performance, I think lets him stay here. He was quarterback 6 last season. And
Mhm.
Dave, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 finishes in the top 12 as a quarterback 1. Brock Purdy had himself what was looking at one point like an MVP caliber season. I know there was talk of that, whether you believe it was going to be happening or not. He's still in a fantastic offense. He still has these fantastic weapons. So I I don't know. I would gladly keep him in this tier, and I think he's the last guy that I would really want as a starting quarterback going into the season. Not that I don't like the guys in our next tier, like Caleb Williams, Trevor Lawrence, and Jared Goff, but if there's someone that I look at and I say, man, he's got legitimate top 6 upside because of the offense he's in, Brock Purdy really feels like that last guy, Dave.
Yeah, and it's so tough just talking about the San Francisco 49ers because it all feels like a house of cards that's just
Oh,
like
I know.
waiting to collapse because like every player is so wildly efficient. And you look at any other team and like, if it was a not this Kyle Shanahan offense, we'd just be talking about expected regression from every single player. But we haven't seen that in San Francisco. Like George Kittle is playing some of the most efficient football of his career. Debo Samuel is still balling out. Christian McCaffrey has gotten better every single year he's been in San Francisco somehow. Brandon Ayuk, won't even talk about him because we don't know where he's going to be by the time this episode airs in 2 hours. But yeah, like Brock Purdy, we look at the efficiency numbers and we say, well, this can't maintain. There's no way he could possibly do this, but he's done it since the second he stepped on the field for the first time 2.5 years ago, and just continues to do it. So it's hard to bet against Brock Purdy. And he is one of my most drafted players. Actually, among quarterbacks, he's my most drafted quarterback. And it's not because I want to draft a ton of Brock Purdy, but it's because, like I said, with Joe Burrow and CJ Stroud, I'm kind of looking for the stacks here. And that's the only time I really want to draft Brock Purdy. And I find in so many drafts that I end up drafting Debo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk or George Kittle. And once I have one of them on my roster, then I'm sitting here in round 12 and Brock Purdy's still available. And I say, yeah, sure, why not? And I just end up kind of drafting Brock Purdy uh, just to have more exposure to the San Francisco 49ers. Like I said, it's a weird pick. It feels like a house of cards, but he's been doing it for years now, and we could probably expect him to do it again this year.
You know, something as simple as you just going, he belongs in the next tier makes me sit there and go, yeah, he probably does. And I take a look at it, and I mean, it wasn't that
I just
simple.
saw that you changed it on the show sheet.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not that easy to sway, but it's also when you're doing these rankings, it's not just how good the player might be, but it's how good or how productive the players around that quarterback may be.
Mhm.
And if we want to keep Jared Goff at quarterback 14 in our next tier, spoilers, by the way, Jared Goff was a top 7 fantasy quarterback last year and a top 10 fantasy quarterback the year before. And so
Just get him
it
a
makes
poor
sense.
man's Brock Purdy, like on a hyper efficient offense, surrounded by good playmakers, and it's
Right.
like, can Jared Goff do it again? And like he probably will, but you just don't feel good looking at your roster week one when you're trotting out Brock Purdy or Jared Goff.
Well, let's see. There's not a big difference in draft cost, and there's not a big difference in production here or ranking. So, would you rather have Brock Purdy in round 9 or Jared Goff in round 10?
Jared Goff.
Oh, okay. Is any specific reason just because it's later?
I mean, yeah, they're like I said, they're both kind of the same player, and then you're just getting one later. So this kind of again becomes that like the opportunity cost here. What you're giving up in round 12 to get a player like Brock Purdy. That's where you can get a guy like Jalen Wright. You can get a really high end potential breakout running back there, and then still get Jared Goff a little bit later when that uh, upside running back tier starts to dry up a little bit.
Well, we've been doing all this talk about Jared Goff. Let's just hop into the next tier here. Dave, tier number 3.
Mhm.
Quarterback number 12. Let's just start this again. Brock Purdy for the San Francisco 49ers. 13, Caleb Williams. 14, Jared Goff. 15, Tua Tagovailoa. And 16, Trevor Lawrence. You and I are essentially in lockstep, or we flip flopped a couple of names on here. You've got, I think the only changes we have is I have Jared Goff higher than Tua. You have Tua higher than Goff, and that's it. Everything else is the same. So we've talked about Goff, we've talked about Purdy. Let's talk a little bit about Caleb Williams. I know you've mentioned a bunch of times the rushing prowess that Caleb Williams could have here. Is that going to be enough? And the weapons that he has there, is that enough to put him on the same level as a Jayden Daniels and probably rank him a little bit closer? I'm going to ask you to calm your Bears fanhood a little bit as you
Okay.
say this.
You don't need to tell me that. I am a pessimistic Bears fan, all right? Like,
Okay.
I'm always assuming the worst. This team has spent 30 years kicking my teeth in. Like, I'm not a blind homer when it comes to Bears analysis. But I do think Caleb Williams is underrated as a rusher, and we saw that just in this preseason game where, like, he isn't the fastest guy, but he just has a natural knack for avoiding contact and making defenders miss and finding the open lanes. But what I really liked is even on that rushing touchdown, if you watch closely, it wasn't a Justin Fields type of run where the pocket collapsed and he said, "Oh my God, I'm running for my life. I need to get out of here." While he was scrambling, he still kept his chin up and he kept his eyes downfield. He was still looking for the pass until he crossed the line of scrimmage and decided that he was going to run the ball. And that's what I like because that's what you see good quarterbacks do because then the defense starts to pull forward when they think you're going to scramble. And then that's when you can find those open receivers. Caleb Williams, I think it's good to have a little bit of trepidation here because he is a rookie. I think that we both have him ranked pretty close to his ADP, maybe a little bit before, a little bit ahead. Yeah, his ADP is 13, and we both got him at 13. I feel like that's a reasonable expectation, but he could easily outperform that ADP because of the rushing. Now, Jayden Daniels, if he hits his high end range of outcomes as a rusher, he's going to rush for 1,000 or 1,200 yards. I think Caleb Williams' best case scenario is like maybe 500 yards, maybe
Right.
600 yards with a handful of touchdowns. So that's the difference here. Of course, I think Caleb Williams is the better NFL quarterback, and he's got better weapons around him, and he should pass for more yards. I still am okay having Daniels ahead of him for the rushing output, but I think Caleb Williams is probably the safer player. Like if you ask me who was more likely to finish as the overall QB1, it's Jayden Daniels. If you ask me who was more likely to finish outside of the top 20, it's probably also Jayden Daniels. So you're taking a huge swing with a guy like Jayden Daniels, where I think Caleb Williams is probably a little bit safer, but doesn't possess the same ceiling.
And I'm really coming around on Caleb Williams. We both have him ranked as quarterback 13. But to kind of reiterate the same thing I said in our last tier, where I feel like if you're willing to draft Brock Purdy at where he's going in ADP, you should be willing to draft Jared Goff or Tua Tagovailoa, other good game managers with good offenses. And then if you're willing to draft Caleb Williams, a guy who's going to need to play well to make things happen, and he has surprisingly good rushing ability, you should be okay with drafting Trevor Lawrence, the last guy that we have in this tier here, Dave, at quarterback 16. Now, I think for obvious reasons, we are putting Caleb Williams ahead of him. We just think the ceiling's a little bit higher here, but Trevor Lawrence is not that far removed from a QB8 season. And man, the headlines out of Jaguars camp right now with Brian Thomas are fantastic. And last season, I think, was just a big disappointment for Jaguars fans, for Trevor Lawrence drafters. And even in that horrible, horrible season, he was quarterback 13. So are we too low on Trevor Lawrence? Do you think he has himself a bounce back year this season?
I think we're accurately ranking Trevor Lawrence where he belongs to be. It's hard to move him higher than this because we've talked about it before. Like, very good football player, we know that, but the production just hasn't really been there. And that's kind of the fear is that this offense has just been a little bit slow. They do like to run the ball, and as good as Trevor Lawrence is, we haven't really seen the fantasy production over the course of a full season. So. Um, I don't think we should be moving Trevor Lawrence any higher than we have him, but there's a lot of meat on the bone where if he can stay healthy for this entire season, and Brian Thomas is the wide receiver one that we expect him to be, that Trevor Lawrence could easily outperform his ADP. But I think that we, as in me, you, and fantasy drafters and rankers and everybody are doing the right thing to kind of not go too crazy and push him up. I think that he's a great value where he's going, but it's hard to move him any higher than he has based on what we've seen through the first couple of seasons.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on that. Let's go to our next tier here. Tier number 4. At quarterback 17, we've got Justin Herbert. At 18, Kirk Cousins. 19, Geno Smith. 20, Matthew Stafford. 21, Deshaun Watson. 22, Aaron Rodgers. 23, Baker Mayfield. And at 24, Bryce Young. Now, Dave, the guy at the top of this list, Justin Herbert, this was one of my football guys' favorites last year. He was the guy I put down for quarterback, and man, weeks 1 through 11 was looking great. He was quarterback 3 overall in fantasy. Everything was looking good. And boy, in just pure Chargers fashion, it did not finish the way we wanted it to. And now, in more Chargers fashion, Justin Herbert's already coming up with an injury, a tear in his plantar fascia. Am I saying that correct?
Plantar fascia, yep. Which
Yeah.
I will say we made a mistake a couple of weeks ago. I think Jagger said that it's a muscle in the foot. It's actually just a tissue that's kind of underneath the skin. So not a muscle, but it's a painful injury for anybody who's had to deal with it. And Chargers fans are very cognizant of plantar fascia. It's something that Antonio Gates dealt with for like 3 or 4 years, where he was constantly missing games, limited in games, getting pulled off the field. It's not an injury that just disappears. So definitely some concern there.
And I think what that does is it might negate a lot of the upside that we still saw with Justin Herbert, where we knew he's not going to be a volume play anymore. He's not going to be a guy who's going to be passing a ton, but he can still be efficient. He can still hit the deep throws. But where we saw some value was in this Greg Roman offense, was him being able to guy that could rush for touchdowns and run the ball a bit more. And that's actually something he started to get better and better at. And that was why he was a football guy's favorite of mine last year. But Dave, those 52 rush attempts and 3 touchdowns that we saw last year, we wanted him to build off that this year. I don't think it happens now with the injury. I think that
Yeah.
there's going to be a little bit more keeping Justin Herbert upright, keeping him safe. And my worry here with Herbert is that if the Chargers are not good and Herbert continues to have injuries, they could just shut him down midseason and let themselves just go for that number 1 pick.
It's possible. I think that's
We might
we
be
talk about that a
overstating it.
lot in the off season, yeah, and it rarely comes to fruition, but it's certainly possible. But Herbert is a guy that I just, earlier in the season talked about him as a great value, that I wanted to draft Herbert because you look what he's done through his first few seasons, more passing yards than any quarterback through the first 4 years. In NFL history. So, like, I wanted to bet on that and say, I think all of these concerns about the new offense and the run game and the lack of weapons are overblown. But now with the foot injury, even where he's getting drafted right now is QB 17, I'm okay passing on him. Even in like 2 quarterback leagues, knowing that I can get Geno Smith or Deshaun Watson or Bryce Young or Sam Darnold later, I'd prefer those guys cheaper than paying up for Herbert, who is going to be on a run first offense, is injured, doesn't have any weapons. There's a lot of concerns there where I just don't know, like, even if everything does work out for Justin Herbert in this new offense, how high his ceiling is. Like, how much is he going to actually outperform this QB 17 price tag? Probably not much.
And that's the thing, you hit it right there, is that if you get to the point where you're looking at Justin Herbert as your starting quarterback in a draft, you're probably fine kicking that can down the road a little bit further to some of these other guys. And you could, even though we don't normally advise this, you could even possibly take 2 quarterbacks and just see what you got there with guys like the ones you mentioned, Geno, Deshaun, Stafford, all those players. And right now, Dave, when I pull it up here, Justin Herbert is going on average in the 12th round, whereas guys like Deshaun Watson, 14th round, Baker Mayfield, 14th round, Geno Smith, 15th round. You could just keep waiting. You could just keep
Exactly.
waiting another round or 2.
Yeah. And then what you do with, if you do get one of those kind of boring veterans, if you end up with a Matthew Stafford or a Geno Smith or something like that, we know the ceiling probably isn't there for those guys either. Like, best case scenario is they're finishing as a back end QB1, somewhere in like the QB8 to QB12 range. So I think what I do if I end up with one of those guys who is going to give you a relatively safe floor, but maybe not the highest ceiling, I want to pair them up with a guy who's just a total lotto ticket. Give me a Drake May or a Bo Nix or a Sam
Mhm.
Darnold, somebody who has just a ton of unknown to potentially finish much higher than we expect. So I'll kind of do that, again, go back, Andrew Cooper, our friend, talks about that with tight ends all the time, kind of doing the yin and yang strategy. You get one boring veteran and then one super high upside young guy. I think you can implement that same strategy in quarterbacks if you do end up waiting this long.
You're talking about those quarterbacks where you're waiting this long. One of the guys that we are both ahead of consensus ADP and probably rankings as well is Geno Smith. Now, I know I'm a bit higher on Geno. I've got him as my quarterback 18. Dave, you had him as quarterback 20. He is currently being drafted as the quarterback 23 off the board. For me, it's odd to see because I do think that Geno does have the upside of, some of the guys in the tier above him. There is a little bit of that rushing ability still. This should be an improved offense. This is a quarterback that is 2 years removed from a quarterback 5 season. Granted, that could be an outlier. And I think that's why we're okay drafting him where he's going in the 15th round. But to me, I know we talked about Kyler Murray being probably the best draft value, but man, if that doesn't work out for you and you just keep kicking that can down the road further and further with quarterback, I'm really happy getting Geno Smith in, let's say, the 13th round of my drafts where I'm able just to pile up a bunch of players at receiver, running back, tight end over and over and over and pair Geno with, like you said, a high upside guy that could come on later in the season like a Drake May. So Geno Smith, what makes you put him a little bit higher than, let's say, you've got him over Matt Stafford, you've got him over Aaron Rodgers, you've got him over Baker Mayfield. So what puts Geno Smith ahead of those guys for you?
Like you said, he's got a tinge of rushing upside there, which like Matthew Stafford might finish the year with negative rushing yards. Like he's not going to be rushing at this point in his career. So Gino does give you a little bit more upside there, but a good offense with really good playmakers, both wide receivers, running backs, and even Noah Fant there. No scrub at tight end, but then Ryan Grubb being there as well should make this a better offense that's going to pass a little bit more and up their play rate a little bit. So I like Gino as a guy to target in the late rounds, but my guy that I've been targeting much more aggressively at that part in the draft is Deshaun Watson, who I've got as my QB 17. ADP is QB 21. You've got him at QB 22. So I'm okay taking Deshaun Watson ahead of Geno Smith just because we saw it last year. In 3 of the 5 games that he played, he was top 10 quarterback. In another game, he was the QB 14. So I think that the ceiling is still there for Deshaun Watson. And it's been a rough start to what he has done with the Cleveland Browns. But, this is a guy, while he was in Houston, we saw nothing but top 5 quarterback finishes. And now with Jerry Jeudy there, with Amari Cooper still there, David Njoku taking this step forward, and them not really having a running back, with Nick Chubb not starting the year, they're going to have to throw a little bit more. We saw some of the rushing upsides still there for Deshaun Watson last year. I think if there's one guy who's really going to outperform the ADP and give us a top 5 finish out of this tier, I think Deshaun Watson is the most likely.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, there's the rushing upside there for Deshaun Watson, who, I mean, he's not far removed from being the guy who is consistently rushing for over 400 yards on the ground and getting 5+ touchdowns each year. It's not that crazy to think that he could get back to that, at least in the rushing aspect. What worries me is every time I see him on film throwing,
Yeah.
it's just not there. It's just not there. There's something missing. Now there's another new offensive coordinator there in Cleveland. Um, I'm correct on that, right? I just had a brain fart. There is a new offensive coordinator. Yes, there is. That's right. And they're bringing in more of the vertical system that Deshaun Watson is used to from his days in Houston. And they bring in Jerry Jeudy. They want to spread out the field a bit more, but everything sounds right. And I do think like it's not crazy to have Deshaun Watson up where you have him at 17. I think that everything from Justin Herbert at 17 to Deshaun Watson, where I have him at 22, is kind of interchangeable. And you know what? I think I agree with you. If we're going to look at the upside, yeah, I think Watson has some better upside than Stafford. Even more upside. You think more upside than Kirk Cousins? I know you have him ranked above there, above him.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Are we kind of just looking at these old dusty guys, Cousins, Stafford, Rodgers, as just like they're nice to draft, but there's limited upside? Is that kind of where you're at?
Yeah, break glass in case of an emergency. Like I do not want to go into the season with Kirk Cousins, Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers. I mean, the only way that they're paying off at ADP, the only way that they're making it in your starting lineup is if we're looking at unbelievable efficiency here, where these guys need to have career high touchdown rates, they need to throw the ball a ton. There is just no rushing upside at all in a 42-year-old Aaron Rodgers coming off an ACL tear and a 37-year-old Kirk Cousins, whatever. these guys are old and they're coming off injuries. Like there's going to be no rushing upside at all. If you're looking for a guy who is just going to throw the ball a ton and not rush the ball at all, I'd rather pay up for the guys a little bit earlier. Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, Brock Purdy, guys that have a smidge of rushing upside. I just don't want these old aged quarterbacks at all on my team this year.
So then this actually, as we're talking here, and I made my adjustments in the rankings, this actually moves this tier around for us. So Justin Herbert will remain at quarterback 17, but then that puts Deshaun Watson at quarterback 18, Geno Smith at 19. Then we get down to 20, where it's Kirk Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, and Matthew Stafford consecutively. And then down here at the bottom, Dave, we've got the former Carolina Panthers quarterback Baker Mayfield. He was there for a cup of coffee. And then the new Carolina Panthers quarterback Bryce Young. Both these guys now have connections to Dave Canales. I think the worries with Baker Mayfield are kind of baked into his ranking and his ADP. And I think
Is that on purpose?
no, it
About
wasn't.
Baker
I'm so
Mayfield are
proud of
baked in.
myself.
That was a good one. That was a
Yay.
good
Good
one.
job, me. Good job, me. And then I do think that a lot of the excitement and the projection for a guy like Bryce Young is baked into his ranking and ADP as well here. Let's just play a little game here. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that Baker Mayfield could finish as a top 12 fantasy quarterback?
2 out of
Okay.
10.
2 out of 10. And
Yeah.
what is that number for Bryce Young?
2. Like I'm not super confident in either of these guys. Like
Not
I
helpful.
yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I'd prefer Bryce Young because he is cheaper and hopefully he can take that step forward, but I don't feel exceptionally great about either of these guys. And I think what you said is like confidence. How confident are you in these guys? And confidence is close to zero. I mean, it could happen. And I think in 2 quarterback leagues, super flex leagues, I'm okay with these guys, but I
Right.
don't know if there's a world in a 12-team league where you're ever going to want to start Baker Mayfield or Bryce Young this year.
Well, that makes me ask a question about some of the guys that we don't have in our top 24. Some of these, let's just call them sleeper quarterbacks that you are likely not starting in super flex leagues. But at 25, we've got Will Levis, 26, Derek Carr, 27, Sam Darnold, 28, Drake May, 29, Bo Nix, 30, Daniel Jones, 31, Gardner Minshew, 32, Russell Wilson, and 33, Justin Fields. So out of this, let's call them sleeper tier here. It's not true rankings. We just kind of grabbed whoever was left there on the football guys rankings. But who is the guy that you think could make the jump to not only just be in the next tier, but actually be a legit fantasy starter going into 2025?
Oh, well, those are 2 very different questions that you're asking me because if you like who could finish in the elite tier this year, it's going to be Justin Fields, absolutely. Like if Justin Fields is starting for the Pittsburgh Steelers, you're getting top 5 production. We've seen it. Like he isn't a great passer, but his rushing upside is so elite that he's just giving you consistent top 5 weeks when he's on the field. So I think that's kind of, again, this is a game of rankings versus projections. And a lot of the guys that we have in this Justin Herbert, Kirk Cousins, Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford, that whole tier are the guys that project to be top 24 quarterbacks. But I don't think I want to draft a guy who's going to be like, I don't want to draft the QB 23 and get QB 20 production and be like, haha, that's what I wanted. This guy outperformed his ADP. If I'm drafting a guy super late in a draft, I'm swinging for ultimate upside. And Justin Fields has that. Like if he starts, you're getting a guy that you are confident putting in your starting lineup in a week in and week out basis. The other guys, I don't have confidence in Drake May or Bo Nix, but I'm okay drafting them because I could be wrong. And Bo Nix and Drake May both have some rushing upside that could really elevate their ceilings. Sam Darnold, another kind of sneaky pick here who probably falls into that same kind of quarterback dead zone with Geno Smith or not Geno Smith, Matthew Stafford and Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins and some of these other guys that we don't have a ton of faith in. But what if, this Kevin O'Connell offense just helps unlock him a little bit and we can get similar production from Sam Darnold than we got from Kirk Cousins in years past. So I think when I get down to this tier where I've just waited to the final 2 rounds of my drafts, the guys that I'm looking at are Will Levis, who has some untapped upside, Sam Darnold, Drake May, Bo Nix, Justin Fields, and as crazy as it sounds, Daniel Jones, a guy who rushed for over 800 yards the year before tearing his ACL. So, don't feel great about any of those guys, but you're just swinging for the fences if you're waiting until that point in the draft.
Yeah, and I think that's the final sentence. Yeah, that you're swinging for the fences if you're waiting to that point. Um, I don't think any of these players are being drafted in redraft. I think there are a few of these players that will be picked up potentially in redraft, like a Will Levis if he has a big week 1 or week 2. I think Sam Darnold if he has a big week 1 or week 2 and there's an injury. The guy that I want a piece of when I can, when it's reasonable, when it makes sense in either a redraft, superflex, whatever it may be, is Drake May, because I
Mhm.
think that's the investment that is only going to get better and better for you as the year goes on. Like you mentioned, there is the rushing upside. This was a guy who was always hovering around 7 to 9 rushing touchdowns per year in college, always above 400 rushing yards as a starter. He's a player that I think I used this stat in the offseason. He had more completions than JJ McCarthy had pass attempts in college. So he's got the experience. He's already looking good. And there's a realistic path here where he could be the starter for the Patriots by like week 3 or 4,
I mean, maybe
especially
week one. They've said that
maybe.
it's still an open battle, and Drake May looked good, like looked really good in
Yeah.
the preseason outing. He might be the week one starter.
Yeah. So I mean, he's one of those guys that I'm willing to, if you've got a really deep bench, I'm willing to take a flyer on him if I waited on quarterback and I have a Justin Herbert, Deshaun Watson, Geno Smith, and then I want to go for some upside, I'll grab a Drake May there. And Dave, it's I don't know that we can necessarily advocate for drafting Sam Darnold, but you mentioned him, and we're both kind of like, I don't know, man. Sam Darnold could be kind of good for fantasy. And you mentioned Kevin O'Connell in that Vikings offense. Nick Mullins last year was a top 12 quarterback in 3 of his 5 starts. If
Mhm.
Nick Mullins is out there doing that, and we've got some of the best weapons, maybe the best weapons of Sam Darnold's career, not out here pounding the table for him. He's not in our top 24, but it wouldn't be shocking. So once again, another guy. If you've got deep benches, if it's a super flex league, I'm not against it.
Can I just be like totally annoying and agnostic here in my approach when it comes to quarterbacks? I think like if you
Sure.
don't get one of the guys that we talked about at the top of the show, like for me, the kind of cutoff point, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, feeling really good about those guys. Anthony Richardson, Kyler Murray, feeling really good about those guys. CJ Stroud, Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, Jayden Daniels, a little bit shakier there, but you're probably okay plugging those guys in. Brock Purdy, Caleb Williams, Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, kind of the same thing. You don't feel great about it. So if I have any quarterbacks behind Anthony Richardson and Kyler Murray, so if I'm taking CJ Stroud, Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, any of those guys, you're probably getting good production from them. But the reality is that you just want to scour the waiver wire because every single year there are guys that pop up that we don't expect. And last year, there was a good chunk of the season where we were plugging Sam Howell in every single week as a starting quarterback. Baker Mayfield, who was going undrafted in 99% of leagues last year, gave us a top 10 finish. CJ Stroud was a guy who was undrafted in most leagues, and you were plugging him in and getting consistent QB1 production. So here, we're sitting here trying to read the tea leaves on, who the guy is going to be at the end of the draft. Is it going to be Justin Herbert, or is it going to be Deshaun Watson, or is it going to be Geno Smith? The reality is it's going to be a guy that we're not even thinking about right now. Like maybe it's Gardner Minshew just lighting it up in Las Vegas. Maybe it's Bo Nix in Denver. Like so what I'm getting at is we could sit here and try to tell you who the late round quarterback is going to be. But the reality is that by week 2, 3, 4, we're probably going to have a pretty clear picture of what quarterbacks look good in what offenses. And then you pick up and stream guys on matchups, whatever it may be. But if you don't have one of those top 7 guys, you just got to scour the waiver wire and potentially stream quarterbacks.
Dave, what are you doing? Why are you pulling back the curtain and letting people know that we don't know the future? What are you doing? You just
You know, it's just
subscribers are leaving by the second.
I'm sorry. It's the
Oh,
reality of it though. Like, and that's why I think the guys that I want, and that's why, if you get one of the top 4 guys because they fall in a good value, if you end up with Allen, Mahomes, Hurts, or Lamar, you feel good. After that, Richardson, Murray, and Daniels are the guys that I want because I'd feel confident about starting them on a week in, week out basis. But outside of that, yeah, I'm just kind of scouring the waiver wire and I'm probably going to end up streaming quarterback on a weekly basis.
The big deep breath and exhale really just provides a lot of confidence as we get to the end of the quarterback rankings episode here. We're almost done with rankings week. Tomorrow we will be back with our tight end rankings. And like we said, we overpromised and we over-delivered. We got you guys 33 quarterbacks here in our rankings that we were able to talk about for even just a little bit on some of them. But we
If
will
you've
be
made it
back.
this far into the show, I'm just going to ask a question of the viewers. If you made it this far in the show, go ahead and leave a comment down below guessing where we have Tyler Conklin in our tight end rankings tomorrow.
Oh,
That's what I want to
God.
hear from the audience. Where do we have Tyler Conklin ranked?
This bit is getting weird, and I'm expecting some sort of a cease and desist from Tyler Conklin's PR team. We have no reason to be doing this.
We don't.
That's
Maybe higher than you
called a
expect.
tease.
Maybe
That's called
lower.
a tease. Oh, God. Okay. All right. Well, we're teasing tight end rankings. We've gone on too long. As always, I want to thank everybody for watching and listening all the way through. Make sure you're subscribed to the Football Guys Daily News Update so you can get all of the latest NFL training camp news as we get ready for the fantasy football season. For myself, for Dave Kluge, thank you guys. We'll see you next time.